the great Egyptian city of Alexandria in 31 BC. The hub of the kingdom has always been the royal palace, but not anymore. Cleopatra, queen of this ancient kingdom, has only minutes to live. She has already lost all power over her 3,000-year-old empire, and now a snake will bring the story to an end. Cleopatra had ambitious goals: to bring an empire that was older than any other back into full bloom, to resurrect its splendid past. Dreams that would end in death and destruction. Ancient Egypt. It is still one of the most mysterious empires in the history of the world. The first light was shed on it 200 years ago, when its hieroglyphic writing was deciphered. Then came the discovery of the tombs of the pharaohs. Ancient historians knew that Egypt is a gift of the River Nile. Before draining into the sea through a vast delta, the Nile runs through 2,000 kilometers of desert. If not for the Nile, Egypt would be no more than a sea of hot sand. The Nile's waters nurtured Egypt's cities, early testimony to a great civilization. The Mediterranean in the north, the Great Desert in the west, and the Red Sea in the east secured Egypt against all enemies for thousands of years. The Nile brought fertility. Thousands of years of peace brought prosperity and the construction of monumental buildings. There was the Temple of Isis at Philae, the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut with its sandstone statues 3,500 years old, or the 20-meter columns at Karnak that once supported the mighty temple of Amun. Even ancient visitors were awestruck by Egypt's grandeur. The Greek historian Herodotus was amazed by what he found.
Look at Herodotus, the father of the history. When he came to Egypt for the first time in the middle of the 5th century BC, he looked at those people. He could not believe. He could not believe that this civilization existed, because he found that the Egyptian created science and technology more than anyone in the world.
So much of the culture that developed on our blue planet originated in Egypt, the cradle of our civilization. And the place where it all started can be pinpointed: Abydos. The first sacred shrine of the pharaohs. The entrance to one of the oldest royal tombs. Here, scientists from the German Archaeological Institute are searching for the earliest traces of the empire. This stone tablet illustrates the brutal methods used by the first pharaoh in uniting Egypt's provinces. The upraised club symbolizes his policy. The ancient Egyptians wrote down everything they considered important. So we know their way of life and their way of death. Their great achievements, and even how ordinary people lived in ancient Egypt. It was almost the same way of life as in rural areas today. Tilled with simple tools and warmed by the ever-present sun, the fertile soil is highly productive. As long as no unusual disasters such as locusts, droughts or sandstorms lay waste to everything, the harvest is rich and no one goes hungry. An unending cycle of good fortune.
The continuity, I think, is a function of the never-changing landscape. The Nile that flooded every year, the sun that rose and set every day, the moon that rose and set every month, all provided the same kind of day after day after day continuity. The basic fabric of ancient Egypt did remain pretty much the same from Dynasty 1 until Dynasty 30. The structure of Egyptian religion was generally the same. The art and architecture was generally the same. The kind of literature that we have, the agricultural practices, all point to a degree of continuity.
The construction of the pyramids was the first high point of the rule of the pharaohs. The pyramids are still a puzzle even today. How did the Egyptians create the seventh wonder of the world from millions of stone blocks? Did the builders use a central ramp? Unlikely, since the ramp would have been larger than the actual pyramid. A spiral ramp would only make sense if it was integrated into the building itself. With this kind of ramp, however, it would have been almost impossible to measure and align the edges. The most likely scenario? Multiple steep ramps, up to 50 meters high, providing access to 70% of the pyramid's volume. Once past 50 meters, a single ramp would have been enough. The pyramids are like symbols for the ancient Egyptian concept of the state. Pharaoh Cheops, the god king, sat at the top of the social pyramid. He and his successors linked the people with the gods and brought order out of chaos. That order underwrote the peaceful development of the Egyptian empire over many centuries.
Die Pharaonen werden gerne als Gottkönige bezeichnet. In dieser Rolle des Königs sehen die alten Ägypter auch die Legitimation und den Anlass, diese gewaltigen Bauleistungen für die Pyramiden zu vollbringen.
Through manual labor, millions of people contributed to the greater glory of the god king. For his part, he guaranteed them a stable society. A social contract that was successful for hundreds of years. The monument as an eternal claim to power. Like their buildings, the names of the pharaohs are still remembered to this day. Akhenaten, the one chosen by the sun, and Nefertiti, beauty, arriving. The world-famous temple of Ramses II, the pharaoh who ruled for 64 years, was cut from the living rock. The last queen of Egypt ruled for only 15 years. She chose this temple in Dendera as the monument to immortalize her name, Cleopatra. Standing at the end of those 3,000 years of Egyptian history, she tried everything to save the empire. By the last century before Christ, Egypt, a land of milk and honey for more than 3,000 years, had long since lost its position as a great power. Another people now dominated the whole Mediterranean world. Systematically, step by step, the Romans had conquered one land after another. Rome now decided the fate of nations, including that of Cleopatra and her empire. Roman senators would decide Egypt's future. It was they who weighed the pros and cons of Rome's foreign policy. All the lands surrounding the Mediterranean had already been declared Roman provinces, all except one. By Rome's grace, Egypt alone was permitted to remain a sovereign state. But the breadbasket of Egypt was no longer safe. The rich harvest from the Nile was too important. All her dreams had died. Alexandria was still a safe haven for the time being. But how long would the ancient gods be able to protect the empire? Cleopatra had no illusions. She knew she was playing for high stakes. In the eyes of most Egyptians, Cleopatra too was an unloved stranger, whose ancestors were conquerors from Macedonia. It was therefore all the more important for her to preserve ancient tradition and to worship the old Egyptian gods.
When foreigners came into Egypt, they did not seek to impose their culture on the Egyptians. Quite the reverse. They sought almost immediately to adopt Egyptian culture for their own needs. They knew that Egypt had been around longer than any other culture. They knew it had been here for 2,500 years, and it probably would have seemed silly to change something that obviously had worked so well for so long.
One of the permanent duties of all pharaohs was to build and maintain the countless temples. And to establish his credibility, each king had to demonstrate his military skills to the people, even if some of the enemies they allegedly defeated had never existed in the first place. His subjects believed the propaganda. The memorial to Pharaoh Thutmose describes countless victories that the glorious general supposedly won on behalf of the empire on the Nile.
Propaganda was very important. They had to do it. Because look, the king cannot be a god without smiting the enemies of Egypt. But what's happened if the king was defeated?
The temple inscription calls him the favorite of the gods, Ramses II. He became ruler of Egypt in 1279 BC. Well over 1,000 years before Cleopatra was born, he had a political education in war and peace. Of course, the world of Ramses was completely different from that into which Cleopatra was born, and also from that of his ancestors, the great pharaohs. The capital from which he ruled was no longer Thebes or Memphis, it was Pi-Ramessa. German archaeologists are conducting tests on the grounds of the ancient royal city. Dr. Helmut Becker uses a cesium magnetometer to produce something like an underground X-ray. Without any digging, Dr. Becker can visualize the foundations of the ancient capital to a depth of 5 meters. Of special interest are the fortifications of a vast army base. What was the purpose of this immense military effort? Years before Ramses ascended the throne, Egypt's geopolitical situation had begun to deteriorate. The Nubians and Libyans were becoming serious adversaries, so Egypt was no longer isolated and shielded by the sea and the desert. In the east, a strong Assyrian empire had risen, whose military arm, like that of the Hittites, was reaching out for Egypt. In addition, seafaring nations were threatening the trade routes across the Mediterranean. Egypt's position had become precarious. This made a proper defense strategy even more important. In Pi-Ramessa, the hub of Ramses' rule, archaeologists have discovered the quarters of the pharaoh's elite troops. Some of their finds are spectacular.
Wir können über die Ausgrabungen in Verbindung mit diesen Objekten nicht nur die Funktion der Gebäude feststellen, sondern auch die Anzahl der Pferde, die zum Beispiel in den Stallungen gestanden haben. Mindestens 480 Pferde haben dort gestanden, also für 240 Streitwagen.
Egypt had joined an international arms race. Technical innovations were revolutionizing traditional warfare. The introduction of the war chariot increased the pace of operations and allowed troops to cover vast distances quickly. With this technology, young Ramses felt confident to launch offensives against the Hittites. He knew that a war would concentrate all the energies of the nation, and his people longed for national unity. Setting out from his base in Pi Ramessa, Ramses split his army near Gaza in order to guarantee supplies in this barren land. That proved a tactical error. Even before the columns were reunited, a battle broke out near Kadesh. The Hittites had deployed near the Kadesh fortress. Ramses' general staff advanced without cover. The bulk of his troops were supposed to follow later, an error the Hittites quickly exploited. After wiping out the leaderless part of the army, they attacked Ramses himself. For the king, the struggle was almost hopeless. All that saved him was the last-minute arrival of his second column. His troops just managed to bail their pharaoh out.
Für Ramses II. Muss es in seiner Jugend eine ganz tiefe traumatische Erfahrung gewesen sein, in der Schlacht von Kadesh nahezu eine Niederlage erlitten zu haben. Die Einsicht in die Unmöglichkeit einer militärpolitischen Lösung aller Probleme seiner Zeit hat Ramses II. Dazu geführt, den langen Weg zum Frieden zu beschreiten.
The long road to peace, and the old wisdom that Egypt would profit more from peace than from war. At his Pi Ramessa excavation site, German archaeologist Dr. Edgar Pusch has found evidence that the young pharaoh learned his lesson.
Nach der Schlacht bei Kadesh im 5. Regierungsjahr Ramses II. Wurde zwischen ihm und Ratuschili III. Ein Friedensvertrag geschlossen in seinem 21. Regierungsjahr. Wechselseitiger Nichtangriffspakt, wechselseitiger Beistandspakt. Ramses II. Und Ratuschili III. Standen jedenfalls in bester Beziehung zueinander. Und der endgültige Schluss und Friedensschluss wurde dann vollzogen durch die diplomatische Heirat zwischen der ältesten Tochter Ratuschili III. Und Ramses II.
The peace treaty was worth more to the unity of the country than all the war chariots and military efforts put together. Did Cleopatra remember this 1,200 years later? She too wanted to preserve the empire through peaceful means. But there was one thing: Octavian, the new hope of the Romans. Alexandria was no safe haven now. Octavian's legions would come and occupy the city. They would force their way into Cleopatra's palace and find the queen. Cleopatra was now alone. Was it the end? The last queen of Egypt. What was left for her? Now, would she be dragged through the streets of Rome as a trophy and then pine away in a Roman dungeon? Cleopatra made a different choice. She joined her ancestors. The pharaohs of the past. Rome was her undoing. Rome and its new ruler Octavian, the Emperor Augustus. The Roman Empire was happy to take Egyptian grain, but preferred to do without an Egyptian queen who meant nothing but trouble. And Augustus enjoyed being hailed as the new pharaoh himself.
Kaiser Augustus gliedert 30 vor Christus das antike Nilland dem römischen Imperium ein. Er tritt hier in diesem Relief des Kalabscha-Tores als Pharao in altägyptischer Tracht mit altägyptischen Insignien auf. Und nur die hieroglyphische Beischrift hier oben benennt ihn als Romaios Kaisaros. In ägyptischen Schriftzeichen ein griechischer Name für einen römischen Pharao.
Octavian was the new ruler of the known world, and Egypt was now part of his empire. The Romans called the new era the Golden Age. As a sign for all the world to see that Egypt was now in the possession of Rome, Octavian had the obelisk from the Sun Temple in Heliopolis brought to Rome. From then on, standing on the Field of Mars, it adorned the Roman capital as a trophy, visible from afar, and it doubled nicely as a sundial. But that wasn't all. The golden ball that once captured the rays of the Egyptian sun now shone under another sky, as if the ancient gods had transferred their blessing. Egypt, with all its splendor, had become a chapter in the history of Rome.